Well, good evening. On behalf of Fairfax Community Church, it's a delight for me to welcome you to the Global Leadership Forum, an event that is being co-sponsored by Fairfax Community Church and by the Institute for Global Engagement. I'm Rod Stafford. I'm the senior pastor here at Fairfax Community Church, and it's just a delight to have all of you here this evening. Part of the mission of Fairfax Community Church is to engage the culture with the good news of the kingdom. And for us, engaging the culture involves more than preaching and proclaiming. It also involves entering into an authentic dialogue about issues that really matter, issues that affect our lives now and that affect our life for eternity. So engaging involves loving and listening. It involves seeking to understand, and it involves seeking to influence. For us, the good news of the kingdom is that in Christ, God has made all things new. That in Christ, not only are the guilty forgiven, but the hungry are fed, the naked are clothed, the prisoners are set free, the oppressed find justice, the unhealthy find health, and the vulnerable are protected. The dead find new life. Fairfax Community Church is hosting this event as a part of its Great Room Lecture Series. Through the Great Room Lecture Series, we bring together key thinkers and theologians and leading practitioners to challenge and equip participants to live out their faith in the marketplace where God has placed them. It's an honor tonight and a privilege to be co-hosting this particular event with the Institute for Global Engagement. Their purpose and mission very much reflect the culture and the ethos of our church. Dr. Chris Siple is the president of the Institute for Global Engagement. He also serves on the board of Wycliffe Bible Translators. He's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. And he's the founder of IGE's Council on Faith and International Affairs. Dr. Siple is an author, and he is the publisher of the Review of Faith and International Affairs. He speaks around the world on a variety of issues, but in particular the intersection of religion and politics. It's been a pleasure to work with Dr. Siple in the hosting of this event, one that we hope will be repeated in the future. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Siple. Thank you.
Greetings and salutations. Peace be upon you. Thank you, Rod, for your warm welcome. Thank you to the Fairfax Community Church for partnering with us. This has been an absolutely wonderful experience. Indeed, a precious privilege to work with you on these important issues. Before we start, I want to recognize the people who have traveled the farthest to be here tonight. Now, I know there's some Texans out there, and you all think that you're the ones, but that ain't true. We have a special delegation from China. I'd like them just to stand up, and I'd ask that you welcome them to our country and to this conference. They represent three very influential think tanks in Beijing, and we have had the honor of hosting them this past week. And we have talked about many issues of religion and society. And in many ways have preceded this conference because we've sought to think through and address what is the balance between allegiance to a state and the necessity to build global harmony in an age of terrorism or in an age where religion is really part of the problem. And the conclusion that we've come to this week is that religion must be a part of the solution. People have to have the opportunity to have authentic faith recognized and voiced and included in the solutions. Now, there are many things that describe IGE, the Institute for Global Engagement, and some of those things are pleasant. But if I were to summarize IGE in a bumper sticker, I'd say we work for religion to be a part of the solution. We do that in three ways, because if religion is to be a part of the solution, it has to be free to participate in that solution. So foremost, we work for religious freedom around the world. We do that along two strategic vectors, religion and rule of law, and religion and security. And we work in places like East, Central, and South Asia to foster a conversation at the intersection of culture and rule of law, sensitive to the former, consistent with the latter. If religion is to be free, though, you can't just work on the ground. You've also got to work in the mind. And you have to change worldviews and paradigms and other fine-sounding academic words. But you have to change how people think about religion. We have been taught not to talk about two things since we were children: religion and politics. Don't do that in polite company, assuming you keep polite company. But the problem is our national and global security exists at their intersection. So what we have done is we have created the Council on Faith and International Affairs, and it publishes the Review of Faith and International Affairs. It is a multi-faith perspective, and it includes secular worldviews. And its whole purpose is to engender a conversation, an ongoing conversation about the role of faith in the world, positive and negative, and to overcome our own paradigms and stereotypes about religion and be able to talk about it in a positive way. 2 issues ago, we did a special edition on torture. Muslims and Jews and Christians talking about torture. This last one, we talked about the rule of law and transitional societies. Now, these things aren't exactly exciting, maybe, for the first-time reader, but this is how you change mindsets. And so you have to engage. If religion is going to be a part of the solution, we all have to talk about it. We all have to think about it. Now, the last thing that we do in terms of making religion part of the solution set is we feel responsible to engage our own faith community. You can't just talk about it, you've got to live it. And so we've established a thing called the Global Engagement Network. And through that and its website, globalchristian.org, we seek to challenge and equip Christians to think about how they engage the world, such that they're part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And maybe you've heard this or maybe not, but Christians have sometimes contributed to the problems around the world. The Global Leadership Forum is the flagship of the Global Engagement Network. And that is what we are doing here today. Its sole purpose is not to give you the answers, but to challenge you such that you get the questions right. And what we're going to do with this conference and this weekend is that we're going to offer different perspectives: diplomatic, which we'll hear from tonight, Muslim, and humanitarian. Different perspectives on how we think about identity. What does it mean, as we talked about with the Chinese this whole week, to be a Christian? What does it mean to be a citizen of the world? What does it mean to be an American? So we want you to think about this conference not as a conference, but as a first conversation. You're going to have conversations tonight, tomorrow, in the foyer, over lunch. And we're going to encourage you to sign up for ongoing conversations as we move toward Global Leadership Forum 2008, which is going to be on faith and foreign policy. How do you steward America's role in the world? We want you to think about it this year and then have conversations through the year and think about it in terms of how you pray, how you act, and ultimately how you vote. We're not here to tell you how to think, and we're not here to tell you how to vote. But we are here to equip you to make a better decision. And that's what we're going to do with the Global Leadership Forum. So, let's begin the activities with tonight. I'm going to introduce our most distinguished guest. One happens to be my father, and Ambassador Robert Siple. The other happens to be Madeleine Albright, Madam Secretary Albright. You have their bios in your folders. And so this is going to be very short and sweet. If you look at both of them, and I know both of them pretty well, one a little bit better than the other. I've known my father all my life. And I've gotten to know Madam Secretary a little bit these last couple of years as we've had conversations at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she's been so kind to receive Muslim leaders that we've brought to the U.S. and have conversations about U.S.-Muslim engagement. There's 2 things that characterize who they are. 2 things. You can sum up their amazing bios in 2 words: service, and education. They seek to serve those around them, and they seek to educate others so they can go out and serve. And there is no higher compliment to my mind. So won't you join me in welcoming Madam Secretary Albright and Ambassador Robert Siple. Thank you. You're in the center. Now tonight we're going to ask three very basic questions. The questions are meant to give you some background on our distinguished guests. And then we're going to open it up to the conference, open it up to you, and have you ask questions, and we'll go to about 8:45, 9 o'clock, wherever we end up. The same format will be true for the conversations tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon. And the three questions are basically this. When you were growing up, how did you think about religion and world affairs? Did you think about it? A lot of us didn't. Secondly, how do you think about identity? What does it mean to have a religious identity, a global identity, and a national or American identity? Are those in conflict? Which takes priority? How do we think about those things? And then lastly, how has their practical experience as diplomats shed light on some of those questions? Each will answer the question, then we'll go to the following question. And at the end of the third question, we'll ask people to come forward and begin asking their questions. And if you're not ready for that, I've got some more up my sleeve. So with that, we'll go to the first question. Madam Secretary, how did you think about religion and international affairs or the world as you were growing up?
Well, Chris, it's great to be with you, and very nice that I think there are people out there. The lights make it very difficult, but there are people that I'm delighted to spend this evening answering some of those questions. You know, I have gone through quite a change on this, and I've thought about a lot the particular question you've asked as I started writing my book on the role of religion in foreign policy. The truth is that I grew up in the 50s. I'm a child of the Cold War. And during the Cold War, we didn't really talk about religion that much, although we didn't want anything to do with godless communism. But what was interesting was that people didn't fully understand the extent to which religion played any role at all in some of the other issues. I think people knew, for instance, that Poland was a very Catholic country, but didn't until the 70s focus on the fact that Catholicism was playing such an important role in terms of how that state emerged from communism, or people didn't focus on the fact that Afghanistan was a fairly religious place. On the contrary, what happened is that people actually, I was always a student of political science, or taking me forever to get my PhD, and you can relate to that. And then, so kind of a combination of student practitioner, where I really thought about this, and we actually thought the opposite. X problem is so complicated, let's not bring God and religion into it. And so, you know, it was just the opposite. We thought, well, Bob, you would know this. I mean, basically people thought about a rational actor theory, that the country on the other side was operating on the basis of its national interest. The last thing that it would do would start thinking about religion. And I have to say that what was interesting for me, I mentioned Poland. I had studied godless communism a lot, and I was watching the change. And what was very interesting was when the Pope came, there was a Polish Pope. He came to the White House during Jimmy Carter's time. And then he went to Poland on a trip, and the Polish regime did not want him they didn't want him there, and they decided they wouldn't have anything to do with him. And all of a sudden, the parishes were the ones that prepared his whole trip. And there was an awakening, a public awakening of the religion, and it was very clear what an incredible role religion had played in that. When I was UN ambassador, and we were already dealing with a number of issues, and all of us had kind of looked at the war in Northern Ireland. And I remember thinking, how can there be a religious war between Protestants and Catholics at the end of the 20th century? It seemed just unbelievable.
Irrational.
And totally. And then when we started having to deal with Afghanistan and the Taliban, and I went, as I was writing my memoirs, I was going through my notes, and up and down the sides of various meeting pages it would say, learn more about Islam, learn more about Islam. And so, and then we obviously dealt with the Middle East a lot. And it was very evident to me that if Jerusalem was just a real estate issue, we would have been able to deal with it a long time ago. But since the parties believed that that piece of land was given to them by God, there is another presence in the room. And so as I was really working more and more, I had the complete opposite aspect from what I had grown up with, which was, what do you mean, leave God and religion out of it? That's the whole issue. You have to understand the role that God and religion plays in foreign policy. So I've gone through quite an evolution on this.
Thank you. Father.
Son. Well, somewhat different reporting out than the secretary. Where I grew up, a little place called Harmony, New Jersey, a place that had, someone's heard of Harmony, New Jersey, a place that had, when I was born, more cows than people, still the case today. Religion was the only thing we talked about. Everybody was religious. My mom was a Christian, my dad was a Christian, my brother was a Christian, 4 sisters were Christian. We used to argue about it, but that's all we talked about. It was big in this idyllic pastoral community of Harmony, New Jersey. And I want to take a couple minutes, if I can, Chris, just to take the pilgrimage from Harmony to another place I spent some time around and in Hanoi. But in Harmony, we all looked alike, we all dressed alike, we all thought the same thing, we all read the same Bible. They were Schofield Bibles. I think we all underlined the same set of notes. Just to give you one anecdote. We used to have these summer Bible conferences. We all would go, and at the end of the day, we'd start a bonfire and sit around the bonfire and sing 49 verses of Kumbaya, and then everybody would give their testimony. And someone would stand up and say, by the way, this was back in the 50s too. This was back when people got saved. Now we come to faith. You know, it's so Presbyterian. But back then it was Baptist. You know, we got saved. So someone would stand up and say, I got saved during the 14th year of my life, and this is the experience. And he would sit down, she would sit down. A couple of minutes later, someone would stand up, and I found Christ during the 12th year of my life. And someone would stand up when I was 9, you know. It was like a reverse auction. We were competing against each other. We were so religious. I want you to know something. I became a Christian during the 5th month of my mother's pregnancy. Now, some of you Calvinists go back further than that, but for me it was the 5th month. And in the 6th month, if you know anything about Harmony, New Jersey, I became a Republican, Madam Secretary, and the gates of hell hath not prevailed against either one of those two thoughts. We had every answer to every question. We loved to stand up on our spiritual tiptoes and tell anybody and everybody how we felt, what our identity was. Our identity was essentially in this rural community of Harmony, New Jersey, was a religious identity. Now, fast forward about 20 years. It was in February 1968. I was sitting on top of a bunker reading the Stars and Stripes, and the ops officer of our squadron came by and said, Siple, you got the Rolling Thunder mission tonight. That always created a little bit more of a pucker factor because they were the Deep North missions. And I asked to see the target folder, and it was Radio Hanoi. This was a 100 square foot blockhouse in the middle of downtown Hanoi. It's where the signal came that launched the Tet Offensive. And the military mind being what it was, we were supposed to go and drop 3 2,000-pound bombs on this. And immediately everything I ever believed about my faith got challenged. I got to tell you, I was gripped by a raw and paralyzing fear for a very simple reason. I didn't think we could get there and get back and still be alive. And I started thinking that afternoon about all the things that I would argue about and how I was so sure of everything, and how my faith was such a bulwark. And I came to this moment in time and realized that the reason Christians aren't afraid to die, for example, is that God hasn't told us what's going to happen. And if you knew that at 10:20 over Radio Hanoi it was going to happen, it would challenge every part of your faith. Now, that night unfolded fairly well for us. We got halfway to the target. The electronic countermeasure aircraft had problems, had to turn back. The mission was scrubbed. We stopped bombing the north in March of that year. In November, we didn't bomb anywhere in the north, and eventually came home, and the war ended. Now, I tell that story because that changed everything about my faith. First of all, it knocked the triumphalism out of my faith. Americans tend to be very triumphal about things, especially the absolutes. And the problem with absolutes is we don't know them absolutely. And so I got a massive dose of humility. My language changed. Hopefully my evangelistic methodology changed from one of confrontation to one of incarnation. I found other ways to talk to people about my faith. But I'll never regret having the experience which focused so much of this. I had a friend in Africa. They tried to assassinate him 3 different times. He said, there's nothing that focuses your faith like an assassination attempt. Winston Churchill once said, there's nothing more exhilarating than to be shot at without result. They're both right. It happens. Well, 2 lifelong learnings from this. One, my theology has to touch the ground. It has to be practical. It has to work. And secondly, my faith has to work in difficult places. When we started IGE, we started in China, in Laos, and Uzbekistan. And if those countries weren't more difficult enough, we went to Vietnam and then to Pakistan. Faith has to work in difficult places. And if it doesn't work in difficult places, throw it out. I mean, if we can only share it here in Fairfax County, I personally would rather go out and eat, drink, and be merry if it doesn't work in the hard places as well. The verse that I kind of focus around for this evening, you've all heard it, be in the world but not of the world. That's the tricky part. The first part is very easy. If you're an activist at all, you want to be engaged. You want to be globally engaged. You want to be in the tough places. You want to be on the edge. You want to be part of the action. Our faith is not a spectator sport. We got to be involved. We got to be engaged. The second part is a little trickier. But don't be of the world, which is to say be set apart from the world, which is part of the definition, unfortunately, of holiness. When Christ died on the cross, the temple veil was rent from the top to the bottom, which is to say the Holy of Holies was now opened up to the whole world. And I spent a lifetime looking at that incident from my perspective. Hey, I now have access to a holy and righteous God through the mediation of Jesus Christ. But do you ever look at it from God's point of view? Telling us again, hey, everything is holy. Everything is holy. Institutions, structures, ideologies, individuals. And by extension, then, everything has to be redeemed. You're all familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan. He gets beat up by a robber, and he's laying on the side of the road, and the Good Samaritan comes and takes care of that one individual person. But there comes a point in time when we not only have to take care of the person lying on the side of the road, we've got to go up in the mountain and roust out the robbers. We have to change the structures. We have to do justice and love mercy. The other thing that's harder today is that Jericho Road is so much wider. In fact, it's as wide as the bandwidth we can afford. And here, all of our backgrounds, all of our learnings, all of our inputs are important to understand how this knowledge that has exploded has made us accountable for what we know and responsible for what we do. Thanks for letting me tell you a little bit about myself. Henry David Thoreau opens his book Walden, and he says, I wouldn't talk about myself if there's anybody else I knew as well. Forgive me for being like that.
These are issues of identity. The commonality between both of your responses is you both started out in a place that was certain. And over time, you were forced to be exposed to other things. Let's talk a little bit more about the identity. It's so much easier to be defined against something. It's so much easier to have all the answers. Black and white, left and right, blue and red, blah, blah, blah. How do we think about these identities, and how do we allow for them in the world? That somebody could have a religious identity, and a national identity, and a global identity. Do they come into conflict? Is there a way to balance them? What has been your experiences with this?
Well, I think the hardest part as you're evolving in life is that you have a number of identities. Not multiple personalities, but a number of identities. I mean, I think people are, they're members of a group, or they're parents, or they are workers, or they're consumers. People are a number of different things at the same time. And I think that it's something that we know how to balance a little bit in our private lives. It gets more complicated in public and private lives. In my case, I can honestly say I have a lot of simultaneous identities. And specifically, as far as religion is concerned, a very complicated and confused one. I was raised a Roman Catholic. I married an Episcopalian and found out that I was of Jewish heritage. So, got it pretty much. But I think it's very interesting to then think about what one has learned, what one believes, and how that religion works. I think the hard part is really how you, and it has a lot to do with what you said, Bob, is how you connect what you believe on Sundays with what you do on Monday. And that is something that really comes out when you are in a public position. And I think the hard part is how when I wrote this, well, I first gave a speech at Yale Divinity on the role of God in religion, and the title of it was The Mighty and the Almighty. And then I laid out a thesis about how religion plays a role, and there was a very famous professor at Duke University who was head of their theology department. He started attacking me, and he said, a good Christian cannot be Secretary of State. And the reason, I guess, is because you actually had to use force. And so I thought about that, and then I thought about, would you actually vote for a presidential candidate who after 9/11 would have said, let's turn the other cheek? How would you deal with that? Or forgive 70 times 7, or look for justice in the next world? How do you, in fact, keep your religious sense with exactly what you were saying, and yet function in a world where somebody is killing somebody else for what they believe? And how do you really justify that action? This came up very much in a practical way of whether I happen to believe in peace, but I'm not a pacifist. And so under what circumstances would you really use force in order to stop somebody else from ethnically cleansing a whole group of people? And I think that becomes a very difficult issue, and in terms of how we see our political leaders and how they translate what they do on Sunday into what they do on Monday. The other part that's very hard, and you talked about certainty. I think that the problem really becomes is, you know that you need to abide by your principles, but do you have an absolute answer for every solitary act that happens? Do you sometimes have to weigh what morality really means? How do you decide what your priorities are? And I think that it becomes a very difficult time. And for our presidents who take an oath and swear to God, how do you balance all these things? Now, we have never actually elected an atheist. We have never elected a non-Christian. But the question about what role religion plays in the role of a particular president or a political leader, I think makes a very big difference. Now, I was often asked a lot about how my religious background played as Secretary of State. And I know that being of a variety of backgrounds, it's hard to tell, but basically I knew that I had a set of principles that I wanted to abide by, But the question is ends and means again. It's a very complicated thing. And I wanted to read one quote, because this is from a very important political scientist, Michael Walzer, and if I could just do this, because it explains the problems of how you have to compromise. Politicians are constantly forced into compromises that are, as we say, morally compromising. They do less than they know they should be doing, or they pretend to be doing more than they are doing, or they act badly in the hope that the good will come, or they form alliances with bad people. Some theorists are much too eager to understand and excuse these compromises as necessary features of political life, and others are much too eager to condemn every one of them without making any effort to understand their occasions. These are two ways of getting morally lost. In the first case, one is lost in the endless adjustments of principle to expedience, and in the second one is lost in the distant reaches of righteousness. So in Walzer's views, American leaders have four moral obligations: to protect the lives of your own citizens, to refrain from inflicting unnecessary harm on others, to help people around the world who are threatened by disaster of one sort or another, and to help people who want to help to build a decent and non-repressive political system. And I think, as you both do your work, I think that's the hard part, is who do you work with? Are there these absolute truths? What are the judgments that you have to make? And how do your personal identities, whether your own religious background or whether you are a member of a group, you were in the military, but you had come from Harmony, and the question was how those two played together. In my case, I certainly knew about the Holocaust historically. Little did I know it applied to my family, but it did affect how I felt about what was happening in ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. It did. So it does play a role.
Now, you had said earlier you can't know the absolute absolutely, which suggests that we need some humility. And what Madam Secretary just said, that there are no rigid rules. The key to this, as I understand your response, is that what it's really about is the application of principles and discernment and wisdom in terms of how our identities inform our action. And that is the key thing. Ideas without action are irrelevant. Thoughts on the identity thing?
Let me just address that. I'm probably a little more conservative than you are on that, Chris. I don't know where you went wrong.
I am to the left of the Madam Secretary.
But I agree with the Secretary. No, I think one of the challenges we have, and of course what I've been doing for the last decade is religious freedom, international religious freedom, and religious freedom in this country. We will know a lot about how effective we are in terms of how we maintain the tensions between the richness of pluralism and the strengths of our absolutes. Which is to say, I think we all need a place to stand. I think we need an authority, a text, a model, whatever methodology to come back to. I think we need to be able to do that without compromise, even though we approach the absolutes with humility. Now, let me just tell you why I think we should do that. In the Old Testament, in Isaiah, it talks about, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways and my thoughts different than yours. Why in the world would we think we had every single answer? And, of course, the text in the New Testament is now we see through a glass darkly. It's a smudged mirror. At the very least, we ought to be humble about those absolutes. And if I can just take one other extension of that, I think we learn more and more about them as we learn more and more about the mind of God. And, of course, if you know the Apostle Paul, he said he didn't know the mind of God. And if he doesn't know the mind of God, my goodness. So there's some problems here. But I think that this is not an either-or. We should not set up a false choice. We should find, out of respect, how we embrace the differences and not compromise over them, not cloud them up, not get into this wimpy dialogue where everybody has to be the same. No, there are differences. Maintain the differences and the richness. I mean, that's the beauty of this country. The religious, spiritual, theological richness of pluralism. At the same time, have a place to stay. Now, I agree that identities change, and because we're both children of the 50s or the 40s or the 50s, whatever, life was pretty simple in this country then. It was very simple, and it's gotten a whole lot more complicated. For example, let me start at a slightly different place. I think that one of the keys to a happy life is to be able to identify with organizations or people or institutions or theses for which we need not apologize. This will make some of you gag, but Chris and I both have Marine Corps license plates on our vehicles. Tomorrow night, I will go to ESPN and trace the Brown Harvard score 40 years after I graduated from that place. Evangelicalism is an identity. And some of us who are unashamedly and unabashedly in that camp worry a great deal that there are those who have made this a very unattractive faith for 50% of the world, or at least 50% of the United States. World Vision was a great organization to work with. We still sponsor kids. But sometimes they get it wrong. My point is, you can have Marines one day lift them up and as a paragon of virtue. The next day they're knuckleheads. Brown sometimes is too snobby. World Vision sometimes loses its way. And I've already told you what's wrong with the evangelical movement. There's a dynamism to these. And they change. And by the way, every once in a while, they allow for doubt to creep in, which again should be treated with humility. I was really interested in Mother Teresa's diary and what everybody was doing with it. I mean, we gave the atheist a field day. Mother Teresa has doubts. Let me tell you something. I've had doubts. That day planning that trip to Hanoi, I mean, I doubted every single aspect of my faith. I used to have this conversation with Carl Sagan. We worked on environmental issues together. And then we had this long exchange of letters up until the time he died. And he said, I don't understand you Christians. You have an answer for everything. Nothing ever changes. And then you synthesize it to a bumper sticker. We got it. You need it. Look out, world. Here we come. The Bible says it. I believe it. That settles it for me. I hope none of you have that bumper sticker on your car. Now, you'll be out there scraping for shortly. He said a scientist has to doubt as a methodology. And Mother Teresa never gave up her call. She never gave up her approach to the world. She never gave up her perspective on how that world should be treated. But there were long periods of silence. From another perspective, I was born a white, male American. Absolutely nothing to do with that identity. But think about it historically. I had a pretty easy time of it. And because I had a pretty easy time of it, I think there's some obligations and responsibilities that come with it. Not triumphalism, but at least knowing that you've got some things going for you in this country that a lot of people in the rest of the world don't have. And so you're obliged. You're responsible. You need to be held accountable for how you use your identity. The Apostle Paul used his. I mean, Rome was his world. Judaism was his nation. And Christianity was his kingdom. And he was very shrewd. He used them in very practical ways. Again, back to the simplicity of the world we grew up in. People would ask me after Vietnam, were you a Christian when you went to Vietnam? And the implied question was, could a Christian really drop bombs on somebody else? And maybe this is very simplistic, but you know, it was either American orphans or North Vietnamese orphans. And there are 3.5 million people in uniform. And there are 500,000 in Vietnam. And I was 22. It seemed pretty simple to me. I've never apologized for that. I wish we could apologize for the spillover. I wish we could apologize for what happened in Laos, what happened in Cambodia, and what happened with folks who never were able to bring that war to closure. Anyway, the identities are there. They're strong. They change. They move around. It's in a dynamic universe. But please don't hear compromise. we can embrace and we can respect and still have a place to stand.
Can I add a point on that? I think I have found a very interesting issue about identity and in terms of us being part of a global community. I think we definitely are in a totally different way than in the 50s. I came to I am neither an American male. I came here from Czechoslovakia. I wanted so desperately to be an American, and so my identity changed in that way. And then I told you about my religious background. So, and I so believe in America, and we'll talk more about that. But now we operate in this global setup, and I think that what's happened is people feel lost within this very large global agenda, and so to a great extent they are looking for identity with a smaller and smaller group. We are finding a variety of ethnic conflicts that people didn't think about before. And I think there's something very natural in that. You were talking about wanting to belong to a group. It's the way that you belong to a church, or you belong to the PTA or the Marines or whatever, and you begin to identify with that, and it gives you a sense of security, whether you're into the multiple identities or not, but you have the security. The thing that is unacceptable, I think, is when pride in ourselves curdles into hate of them. And I think that's the part that raises the identity question, is how, in fact, you can be proud about your various groupings, and we all are, but how it allows for, and you're the one, Bob, who taught me this term, is respect for other people's identities. We use the word tolerate, to be tolerant. And we've had this discussion. I think tolerant turns out to be not such a great word, because
Amen,
it means
sister.
Put up with. You
Right.
put up with somebody. What we really need to do is to respect the identity of others and understand why they are seeking that identity while we seek ours, and we can't start hating them because there's something else.
Can I just ride that hobby horse? I agree. This word tolerance is the wimpiest word, and we just got to get it out of our vocabulary. It is basically a cheap form of grace applied to people I don't especially care for. I don't like you, but I will tolerate you. I mean, how pretentious is that? It's not equality. There's no sense of equality that comes through. We have said for well over a decade in this issue of religious freedom, which, by the way, is a national security issue, and it can be helped in this way. Understand your own faith. And if you've chosen not to believe, understand why. At its deepest and richest best, know why you are where you are. Know why you stand where you stand. Know why you take this particular position. Know your own faith at its deepest and best. The historic verities of the faith, the orthodoxy of the faith, the heroes of the faith, where the heroes have doubted, where they've struggled. Why, in the words of Pascal, good men believe it to be true. Know that as much as you can, and then know enough about your neighbor and your neighbor's faith in order to respect it. Respect is a whole lot different than toleration. Respect takes us to the celebration of a common humanity, the fact that each of us has been created in the image of God. It elevates our discourse. It comes out of understanding and knowledge. The best of understanding, the best of knowledge produces this. Let me tell you about a guy who doesn't do this very well. Osama bin Laden looked at his faith, the whole warp and woof of the Islamic faith, a very rich faith, and began to redact the faith. We used to have the signs in the State Department. It's not politics, it's not ideology, it's not religion, it's murder. Speaking about those kinds of folks. And so he picked and chose, and he basically landed on the lily pad of jihad against the West. And at that point, it became murder. He didn't understand his own faith. He had absolutely no respect for anybody else's. Now, you take a redacted gospel, a truncated gospel, a misunderstood gospel, an inappropriately applied gospel, and you put it in the hands of a religious zealot, and you've got a very, very scary situation. And that's basically what has happened. So, on the positive side, just work at understanding your own Work at respecting your neighbors. And by the way, if everybody were to do that, we would stop sectarian violence in the world. That's why it's a national security issue. There'd never be another war based on religion. The religious wars are longer, more brutal, and more unpredictable than any other kind of war. We could stop them in a moment, and somehow we could get people to understand and respect.
We are already moving into our third question. I would note that after the Secretary answers the third question and we move to the Ambassador, we're going to ask people with questions to come to the middle of the aisle and begin to line up so we can move seamlessly into the questions from you. The bumper sticker of the National Association of Evangelicals is cooperation without compromise. And it's an interesting thing, and I think that aptly sums up what we're talking about here, that we can have multiple identities without multiple voices in our head and begin to move out on some of these practically and with humility. The third question then is, how is your experience as diplomats, both of you? Where do you see some of these things coming together? What were some of the lessons that you've learned, some vivid illustrations or examples of the identities and the religion and the role of international affairs? Secretary?
Well, first of all, I think this has to link to the first question that you asked, which is how did I all of a sudden have this, domestic moment on the road that showed me, in fact, that religion did matter in foreign policy. And I think that the point is that religion does matter. We have to understand that. There's no question about that. I actually believe that religion on balance is helpful, not harmful, though despite some of the excesses that you were talking about. And therefore, religion needs to somehow be managed into foreign policy. I often say that I am neither a theologian nor have I turned into a religious mystic. I am a problem solver. And therefore, in terms of looking at the issues out there, you have to understand the role that religion does really play in diplomacy and try to figure out how to use it, and especially after 9/11. I think it's very clear. I think it might be useful to explain how you and I even know each other, because it is part of this story. What happened was that there was a discussion about how the American government could really be clearer about religious freedom. We had a variety of issues in terms of making sure that human rights were followed out in places, and there were people who really felt very strongly that we also ought to worry about religious freedom. Actually, Congressman Wolf, who I think this is his district, basically was somebody that had this as an issue that he cared about a lot, and there was the Religious Freedom Act. And among the various aspects of it was the fact that the Secretary of State should have a religious advisor, which is how Ambassador Siple came into my life. And it was very interesting because it became clearer and clearer with, as you could tell, all of you from listening to him, what a great teacher he is, about how this really became integrated. And I think that it's very important. And then my sense was, from being a problem solver, how do you actually integrate it into our lives? Now, again, what I had seen already was that the St. Egidio process that the Vatican had brought people together in Bosnia. I went to visit, and there were Catholic priests, but they were bringing a variety of people from the Muslim religion and Orthodox to come together. St. Egidio also played a very important role in Mozambique of bringing people together. I found a very interesting person, the Grand Mufti of Sarajevo, somebody who still does, about a new contract in terms of Europe, that the Muslims need to understand that they are part of a society, and the European countries have to respect the religious background of all their citizens, and he is somebody who plays an important role politically. I think first of all, we have to understand what the religions are, respect them in your statement, and I think that our diplomats, actually, they know a lot about language and culture. They have to add to that a knowledge of religion, of the religions where they are going. It's important that people understand the difference between Sunni and Shia. A lot of people did not. And so I think that having that particular understanding is very important. I think also that diplomats have to feel comfortable in talking about religion. And the really hard part here, we've talked about this a lot. Every time I speak anywhere, somebody says, well, what's the matter with you? Don't you believe in the separation of church and state? Yes, I do. But that does not mean that diplomats should not understand the religions of the countries where they're going. And so they need to be trained, and now the Foreign Service Institute is actually having courses where our diplomats do learn about religion. We also cannot be afraid to use religious leaders in negotiations. That is not a problem about separation of church and state. It doesn't mean they have to sit always at the same table, but a lot of religious leaders can be used in conflict resolution. They can be used as resource people for a lot of when there are negotiations, and then most important of all, they then can validate the political decisions that have been made if in fact they agree with it. I just came from Nigeria. Nigeria is a very complicated country in terms of having Protestants, Catholics, and Muslims, and they have just had an election. The religious leaders came together before the election because some of it was whether the leader was now from the Muslim part or the Christian part, and they were very helpful in the solution. So I do think that there needs to be an understanding of what the role religion plays. You were introducing our Chinese friends. Clearly, China is trying to figure out what the role of religion is. It could, in North Korea, there could be a change. So I think we need to, this is probably, a little sacrilegious in a church, but the bottom line is I see it, I'm a diplomat, I see it as a useful tool in problem solving. But in order to use it that way, you have to understand it, and you have to understand the role that it plays in other people's countries. What I find interesting is I teach at Georgetown, and our students more and more are taking courses, obviously in history and politics, but also it's a school, I teach at the School of Foreign Service. These are people that are going into some form of international work of the role that religion plays in it. So more and more we need to understand that. And I think it can't be viewed as being weird to talk about religion. Just imagine what a difference it would have made in Iraq if initially we had gone to talk to Ayatollah Sistani. He actually played a fairly useful role at the beginning. Yesterday I met with the French foreign minister, who they are taking a new interest in the area. He says he's going to go meet with Sistani. They need to talk to Sistani. So I think we need to understand that religious leaders are playing an important role. One other statement, I spoke about the Pope. One of the really amazing things was when a Polish Pope was named. And I worked for Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Polish. And if I could tell this, just a little funny story here, President Carter, I think, was a very religious man. But he also had a tendency, he still does, of overstating things a bit, and everybody was a really, really good friend. So what happened was the Polish Pope was named, and Dr. Brzezinski is not a shrinking violet, but he called up President Carter, who was somewhere else, and he said, this is so exciting, a Polish Pope has been named. And what had happened, and Dr. Brzezinski said, I met him when he came to Harvard one time. So President Carter gets off the helicopter in the South Lawn, and he gets off, and the press asks him what he thinks about the Polish Pope. He said, it's so wonderful. He is a very, very close personal friend of Dr. Brzezinski's. It was the only time I ever saw this big blush. But the interesting part, and it goes to this point, is, and Brzezinski tells this story, that he and the Pope actually did become good friends. And he said to the Pope, the Pope said to him, you're Catholic, you know a great deal about religion, and I'm interested in how religion has informed your politics. You are also religious. And he says to the Pope, but you are also a very great political leader. And that combination, I think, is something that we need to understand.
Well said. I had it easy in this regard because my portfolio was the promotion of religious freedom, the weaving of religious freedom as a concept into our foreign policy, and then also working the issues of reconciliation where wars were fought along religious lines. I did my best work outside of Washington. I think we've had this discussion once before, but sometimes it's hard to get things. It was hard to get things done inside the building that housed so many people. I would say to you, if you want to go work in the State Department, do one of two things: either go while you're young, or go in as the Secretary of State. Either one of those things you'll be happy with. Sometimes in the middle, it gets a little bureaucratic, but I was away from Washington representing this country, and let me tell you, I know we share this. We all share this. There is not a better country, this sounds jingoistic, but I just mean it from the bottom of my heart, to represent, and having visited a lot of them, and some of them really difficult places, there's not a better country to represent. I was always proud to get into those black Mercedes with the American flags in the front, or whatever we were getting into.
German car.
It's a German car. We had American cars.
When I was in Uzbekistan, and the 13 Uzbeki Mercedes pulled up.
Sorry.
Anyway, I always thought they were Mercedes. My point is this. It was fun. We operated from a position of strength. Now, the reason we operated from a position of strength, and this gets to how diplomacy can work and some of the challenges behind it, I never once had to compromise American values for American interest. I used to sit in meetings where we talked about national interest. I never heard people talk about national values. And national interests were kind of the realpolitik side of things. Our trade routes, our economic trade paths, our military security around the world. The moral imperative side, the soft issues. And I would say to people, look, good people can negotiate the hard issues. People die for the soft issues. But when I went out representing a portfolio of religious freedom, I felt that almost by definition, American values and American interests were one and the same. And you could offer them totally without compromise. People ask why Americans are hated in the world. And at least a partial answer to why we're not always treated like a long-lost relative is this inconsistency between our values and our interests. And people see that. And yeah, they see us distributing food to the Iranian people after an earthquake, or feeding starving folks in North Korea. But they also see a lot of things that are kind of strange to them, and why we have to have coffee that never goes above $3 a pound, or bananas that never go above 80 cents a pound, and the kind of pressures we put to make sure that the oils continues to flow, and so on. And when there's an inconsistency in the human rights area, I mean, that's the Achilles heel of human rights. And people understood that there was some, and that we were powerful enough to get away with it. Now, I only had a couple of bad confrontations in terms of religious freedom, and not necessarily bad in terms of the people I was dealing with. Of course, the folks in Saudi Arabia weren't really too interested in the International Religious Freedom Act in the United States. But they listened very patiently, respectfully, to hear about it. And then they started to talk about divine legislation in the peninsula, and did it in a way, again, that was respecting. In China, the first words out of the mouth of the Religious Affairs Bureau, a man by the name of Ye Xiaowen, we always referred to him, oh, Ye of little faith. But Ye Xiaowen said, who made you the international morality cop? It's a good question. And we have to know how to answer that a little bit better than our history has portrayed. But the answer I gave them is that, look, we have a number of international covenants, including the Universal Declaration. You folks have signed it. We've signed it. Inherent in those covenants is mutual accountability. If something's going wrong in China, we feel obliged to tell you. And by the way, they now feel obliged to tell us every time something's gone wrong in the United States. But for the most part, we could be very clear, we could be very precise, and we could represent the best of our national interest and the best of our national values without compromise. That's not easy to do. If you remember the second inaugural address from Bush, I think you're going to get Michael Gerson tomorrow, right? I bet you he wrote this. I mean, it was really well done. And you can say, inauguration speeches are nothing. I think when a president of the United States speaks, we ought to hold him accountable to it. But he made a comment halfway through that, and to me it was the most important part of the entire speech. He says, from now on, our values and our interests are going to be one. And I'm sure everybody said, sure. And then a couple months later, we had the situation in Uzbekistan, a place called Attenjan, where a number of people started to protest because of bad food conditions, bad work conditions, and Islam Karimov sent his military in there and massacred somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people. Now, we didn't know how many were there, and we called for an international investigation. And Karimov said, if you want an investigation, it's going to be domestic, which is to say, it's not going to be one. And if you keep pushing this, we will push you out of Uzbekistan. Well, we had a base in Uzbekistan fighting a war in Afghanistan. It was important for us to be there. But we held our own. And we're no longer in Uzbekistan with the military because we made a statement that our values and our interests are one. It's hard to do that as a government. It's not easy. It's a whole lot easier for an individual to do it. I can if I want. I haven't done this, please. But I can certainly forgive Osama bin Laden, if I choose to, for what happened in 9/11. Our country can't do that. They've got to protect its citizens. And so they need to extract justice and make sure it doesn't happen again. Governments don't always have the same opportunities that we have as individuals. I was fortunate I did with my portfolio.
Well, thank you both.